Welcome to this first webinar in a new series ICPVTR is running on the evolving terrorism landscape in Southeast Asia. As we all know, in 2020, due in no small part to restrictions on movement because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the threat situation in our region seemed to be somewhat relatively subdued, though not entirely, of course. However, the recent suicide attack in Makassar, Indonesia on 28 March 2021, as well as the apparent lone actor attack on the Indonesian National Police headquarters in Jakarta just a few days later, suggests that terrorism and extremism has by no means gone away. So in light of the latest attacks, what lies ahead for the Southeast Asia terrorism and extremism landscape? To help us address these issues, ICPVTR is organizing a series of webinars during this year to explore different aspects of the evolving threat picture in Southeast Asia, and of course, what to do about these security challenges. And this is why we have with us this morning a most distinguished speaker, Sidney Jones, to kick off this series by sketching out for us the broad terrorism landscape in the region. Sidney is no stranger, of course. She's the director of the Jakarta-based Institute for Policy Analysis of Conflict, and before that, she was with the International Crisis Group, first as Southeast Asia Project Director, and from 2007 onwards as Senior Advisor to the Asia Program. She's a well-known expert on security in Southeast Asia, particularly Islamist extremism, but she has also published on issues ranging from labor migration to ethnic and ethno-nationalist insurgencies and conflict. She is a top authority on Islamist radicalism in Southeast Asia, as we all know. So this morning, Sidney will essentially lay out the sources and drivers of the terrorism and extremism threat and outline the challenges regional security forces are facing today. Before I hand over to Sidney, please note, after she makes her remarks, we will have some time for question and answer Q&A. Please post your questions on the Zoom chat, and I will moderate the proceedings as we go along from there. So please post your questions on the Zoom chat. So with that, Sidney, over to you.
Thank you, Kumar, and greetings to everyone who's taking part in this webinar. I see there are a number of old friends who have joined. So let's go right in. I'm going to outline the situation in the region, focusing mostly on Indonesia and the Philippines, but touching on some of the other areas as well. Next. I think we need to start by keeping things in perspective and noting that while terrorism is a scourge, it isn't the major source of violence in the region. And we have to realize that state violence, such as is currently taking place in Myanmar, and ethno-nationalist insurgencies account for many more deaths than terrorism. Secondly, if we look at the fatalities from terrorism in the region, the Philippines is certainly the worst case, but that's partly because it faces terrorism from both the left and the right. And finally, just to keep things in perspective, I think it's worth underscoring that nowhere in the region are Islamist extremist movements a threat to national stability. We've got very strong states, we've got good police forces, and the extremists have no chance of toppling any of the states in the region. Next. If we look at the Global Terrorism Index, the database maintained by the University of Maryland, it just helps you get an overall view of Southeast Asia. As I said, Philippines is far and away the worst, the only country in the region that's in the top 10. And there's a complicated way for determining the order and the ranking on this list, but it has to do with the number of incidents and the number of fatalities. Thailand, which is an ethno-nationalist insurgency not linked to the global jihad, is second. Myanmar, with all of its insurgencies, and this is before the coup, this is last year's data, was number 3. Bangladesh, I won't include Bangladesh in Southeast Asia, but because of the migrant population from Bangladesh and the discovery of radical cells among Bangladeshi migrant workers in Singapore and Malaysia a few years ago, worth noting that that's fairly high up. And then Indonesia is only number 37 on this list. So it gets a lot of attention, but there actually are not a lot of terrorist fatalities from groups in Indonesia. Then Malaysia's way down at 76, and Singapore, Vietnam, and Laos don't even appear on the screen because they're so far down. So that just gives you a perspective of where things rank in the region. Next. The concerns are these. First of all, even though we believe that support for ISIS is declining, it can still inspire attacks, as we've seen. And I think it's left a deadly legacy that's going to live on for generations in terms of the ideology which has permeated even non-ISIS groups, the kind of decentralized model of propaganda dissemination, and the propaganda itself, which is going to live online for years, and the camps in Syria, which need to be addressed with a sense of urgency. Second, important to recognize that non-ISIS groups like Jamaat Islamiyah remain active. And the concern is that they have trained militants in Syria, and about 60 of those have come back to Indonesia. And there's a danger that a militant splinter from among some of those individuals could emerge. But it's an Indonesian problem overwhelmingly. JI is not acting as a regional grouping. And then finally, I think that local dynamics, political and otherwise, in Sulu and Mindanao have taken a dangerous turn, and that there is a real risk of more violence in Mindanao that mixes elements of pro-ISIS remnants, some of the kidnapping for ransom groups, and some of the disgruntled fighters from the MILF and MNLF that might turn to more militant groups because of disappointment with what they expected from the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao. So for all of those reasons, I think we have to be particularly wary of the Philippines, but understand that there are other problems in the region as well. Next. So let me turn to the pro-ISIS groups and the ongoing threat from those groups. It's worth noting that virtually every single Indonesian arrested for ISIS activity since 2016 or early 2017 has been able to quote the instructions from ISIS Central that basically, if you can't join us in Syria, then wage war at home. Everyone believes that their bay'at, their oath of loyalty to the ISIS leader, requires them to obey that instruction. And when we've seen actions by individuals who did swear the oath of loyalty to ISIS, they've been able to quote that instruction as a justification for their action. Next. If we look at the ideological legacy, I think that one of the things that ISIS has done is leave behind a much more brutal vision of an Islamic state and a much more takfiri vision of an Islamic state. Takfiri being the tendency to brand other Muslims as kafir or infidel if they don't follow your version of Islamic teachings. And the various groups that were struggling for an Islamic state in Indonesia, above ground and underground. And this may be true in other parts of the region as well. I think have acquired a more takfiri leaning because of ISIS's teachings. This book that I've pictured here, which is basically 10 ways to become an apostate, is a book that's been found in virtually every pro-ISIS discussion group, but it's not an ISIS document. It's a book that's reached in to the Muslim mainstream in a way, but it suggests that one of the legacies of ISIS is this much more rigid approach to fellow Muslims. It's left behind a more literalist interpretation of Islamic law and a greater commitment to the idea of a caliphate. Next. Also, the decentralized propaganda campaign lives on, both in terms of the material left behind on the internet, as well as the model for how you send material out and hope it gets reproduced on social media. Worth remembering that an early analysis of the ISIS themes suggested that 6 basic themes were characteristic of ISIS propaganda: brutality, mercy, victimhood, war, belonging, and utopianism. And we're still seeing this idea of heroic videos of ISIS playing out long after ISIS has lost territory. We also see the idea of the desirability of bringing up your children in a pure Islamic state, propaganda that was very much targeted at women and families living on. And then we've seen the instruction manuals for how to make bombs, including one put together by Bakr, the now dead Indonesian social media king who died in Syria. But his manuals on how to make bombs and how to make lots of other kinds of weapons have now been disseminated so widely, it's difficult to think about how you eradicate it. Next. One of the consequences of this and of the desire to be obedient to your bayat and obey the leader of ISIS is an increase in suicide attacks, including by women. And I think we only have to look at the attack at the police headquarters, which was not a suicide bombing, but it was clearly a woman using a BB gun who was going to get shot by the police as a result of making that attack, as well as the concentration of suicide bombings in the Philippines since the one in July 2018. And in this list, it's just interesting to note the nationalities of the bombers involved. There was some belief at one time that if there was suicide bombing in Mindanao or in Sulu, it had to be by Indonesians because Filipinos were culturally immune from suicide bombing. Well, no country is culturally immune from suicide bombing. And we've seen the bombers come from Germany, Indonesia, Egypt, and from the Philippines itself. Next. It's worth stressing that the increased involvement of women as combatants is generally despite and not because of encouragement of the ISIS leadership. Most extremist organizations, especially from fundamentalist religious backgrounds, have a very conservative notion of gender roles. And we did see a shift in ISIS toward the end when they realized that they actually needed more combatants. But mostly the focus was on women in very traditional roles as mothers, as wives, and as teachers of small children. And like many other groups, including the white power networks, there is an emphasis on indoctrinating the very young. One of the things we see around Indonesia in JAD constellations JAD being the pro-ISIS coalition, is a focus on play groups and kindergartens for children within the network. And this is something that is very difficult for the government to get any handle on, but it's something that is going to have to be addressed if we are to prevent another generation of extremists emerging. Next. Another legacy of ISIS, and an important one, will be the friendships and connections established in a variety of settings, but particularly in Syria and neighboring countries. The safe house in Turkey, where Indonesians and Malaysians gathered waiting to cross over into Syria from about 2016 onwards, also had Indians and Central Asians. So the bonds established living in the same house and waiting to cross over will be something that may come back to haunt us. Also, military training programs where Southeast Asians joined with people from other nationalities. The camps and the prisons in Syria where we're seeing people intermixing. If they ever get out, those bonds may come back to play into interregional collaboration. And finally, the international marriages that have taken place are something that we have to pay more attention to. Worth noting that of the 160 adult women in Syrian camps today, 130 of them are widows. And many of those women, if they're allowed to leave, may well marry fighters from outside Southeast Asia. We just had an incident last week, which is worth noting, where a Filipina national blew herself and her baby up in Tunisia after her husband, who was a Tunisian, was killed in a counterterrorism operation. This is the kind of joint collaboration we could be seeing around the world as we learn of Indonesian women who married Senegalese, who married Chechens, who married Syrians, and so forth. It opens the possibility for collaboration in a way that we never thought of before. So I just noticed your RSIS slogan is ponder the improbable. Well, one of the improbable consequences of Syria is this kind of cross-national collaboration. We also have a case of a Filipina in El Hol camp, one of the big Syrian camps, whose first husband, a Filipino, was killed, and she married an Albanian Kosovar. Interestingly, he was killed. Her sister-in-law from Kosovo had a way of getting her out of the camp, and she refused to leave, saying she had made the decision to join the war in Syria, and she was going to stay with her 5 children, I think, at the moment. Okay, next. No progress is being made in bringing any of these women and children back. Malaysia talks up its intention to bring all of its 53 nationals or 54 nationals back to Malaysia, but nothing is really happening. And one of the big obstacles is that the Malaysian government has diplomatic relations with the government of Assad, as does Indonesia, and they don't want a big publicity campaign by the SDF forces holding their nationals of a big Kurdish flag plus the flag of the country whose nationals are being returned in a way that could jeopardize diplomatic relations with Syria. So those kinds of political problems are either a reason for no progress or a pretext for no progress. There probably are ways around that. But at least in Indonesia, no one wants to take the political risk of actually bringing potential terrorists back. even if you're talking about vulnerable children. And COVID has added a new layer of reasoning for why it's not a good idea to bring anybody back. And yet to leave them stranded is to invite a new generation of terrorists to emerge. Next. Quickly moving to the region here, I want to underscore that ISIS remains a regional concern, including in the Sulu and Sulawesi Seas area. This is exemplified by the connections between the 2019 Holo bombing and the recent bombing in Makassar. Also, just looking at this map, it's interesting to think that at the height of Marawi in the Philippines in 2017, people were concerned about the Philippines becoming a safe haven for people fleeing Syria. Didn't really happen. There were a few cases, but not very many. But nobody's really paid attention to Sabah as a haven. Not a very safe one because the special branch is quite effective. But we've got fugitive Indonesians working as undocumented migrant workers among the million of around 1 million migrant workers in Malaysia more generally. And we've got the huge population of ethnic Tausug immigrants from the Philippines. And the combination means that there are radical cells in Sabah that we need to be paying attention to. Next. If we look at Holo and the Makassar connections in particular, I just love this story because it shows what the linkages are. Basically, it starts with this couple from Makassar who left to go to Syria in 2016, but couldn't get across the border into Syria. So they got stuck in Turkey for 9 months and were eventually deported. They returned to Makassar, frustrated at not having been able to join the jihad there. And Ruli, the man, tried to join Marawi in August 2017, left for Mindanao, but at that point, the army was encircling Marawi and it wasn't possible to get in. So he ends up in Holo, where one of the pro-ISIS camps, particularly one that was welcome to foreigners, was established. And after a year, he sends for his wife and children, entrusting the task of delivering them to an undocumented migrant worker on a palm oil plantation in Sabah, who was an Indonesian fleeing justice from a 2016 bombing in Kalimantan. Just imagine this kind of network. And this fugitive marries one of the children in the family that is going to move over into Mindanao. And then the wife, Ulfa, on the bottom here, and their children leave for Zamboanga in January 2019. The Holo bombing was a few days after they arrived on the 27th of January. The man, the oil palm worker who guided them and who married one of the children, was killed as an Abu Sayyaf fighter in September 2020. His wife, the teenager from Makassar and daughter of this couple, was arrested in Sulu on the 10th of October 2020 last year. And as a result of her information about financial transfers from her family, the extended family in Makassar was fingered for pro-ISIS activities. And on January 6th this year, the Detachment 88 of the Indonesian police makes a raid on the uncle, that is the brother of the woman here, and kills one of the brothers, arrests three other of the brothers, and creates perhaps a desire for revenge from the extremist pro-ISIS group that the uncle killed in the police raid was running. And the young man and his wife, who became the suicide bombers in Makassar on the 31st of March, were followers of this woman's brother. They were followers of the man killed by police on the 6th of January. And it's striking how much the Makassar bombing resembled the Holo bombing. Both were aimed at local cathedrals. Both were husband-wife perpetrators. And you believe that there has to have been some kind of discussion about aping the earlier attack. Next. So here, this is a crazy map, but if you just take a look at the extended family, you can see on the bottom row, these are the children of the couple who did the Holo bombing. And of the children, we have the eldest daughter arrested on January 6th, and she was among the people sending small amounts of money to her sister in Holo. We have one son who actually did make it across to Syria when the rest of the family was stuck in Syria. He made it over at the age of 11, and he's now in one of the prisons in Syria. We have the 10-year-old daughter of the Holo bombers who was married off to an Abu Sayyaf fighter in December last year. So she's a child bride. We have the 12-year-old boy who came over with his mother, who is now a child soldier with Abu Sayyaf. We have Chichi, who's now a widow and in prison, having just given birth to her first child. And that child, unless something is done to change things, could be the third or fourth generation of this family to get involved in fighting. Let's hope that doesn't happen. And then on the upper chart, you see the picture of Ulfa, the Holo bomber, again in the middle. Next to her is the brother who got killed, and then 3 other brothers who are all currently in prison. But it's just an extended family that shows you the networks in this region. Next. Just a note on the East Asia Wilaya. This was the pro-ISIS coalition in the Philippines. And the family I was just talking about was linked to the camp of Hajan Sawajaan, who was the Amir. He was the overall commander of this collection of ISIS units, but he was killed in July 2020, and some other top commanders have also been killed, meaning that the East Asia Wilaya, the only province of ISIS in Southeast Asia, but it was, despite its name, only in the Philippines, it's basically not functioning as a coalition any longer. It's more returning to its component parts, but with, again, the pro-ISIS ideological legacy still very much apparent. And one of the things that we're seeing is a gradual breakdown into the ethnic and regional parts, and the consequences of not getting any funding from ISIS Central. Once ISIS Central stopped providing funds, we saw an increase in kidnapping attempts from some of the pro-ISIS factions on Holo, partly because they needed the money. Next. We're also seeing real serious political power jockeying in Muslim Mindanao. And I won't go through all the various factions, but only to note that one of the real dangers now is that disgruntled fighters who believe the peace process hasn't delivered turning to more militant groups as a way of expressing their resentment. Next. So what about JI, the anti-ISIS organization? We've had more than 100 JI members arrested in the last 6 months in Indonesia, and the total number of JI members in prison is almost 200 at the moment. One of the things that's striking is that most of these people had no plans of getting engaged in violence. There was one exception of a splinter group that was indeed planning an attack. But one of the reasons that the Indonesian government was so concerned was because they had been systematically sending fighters for training to Syria with a range of different militias. Some of their fighters were sent to the Al-Qaeda linked militias. Some were sent to Ahrar al-Sham, a more Salafi militia, and a couple of delegations were sent to ISIS just to see what the training was like and to see if they could learn anything. Those delegations refused to make the pledge of allegiance to ISIS, and the fighters were imprisoned as a result for a while before they were allowed to leave and return to Indonesia. But it was the discovery of this training that triggered the information on the leadership and the whereabouts of top JI leaders. One of the things that became clear from the arrest is that JI did indeed have a long-term plan of infiltrating the government, building up an armed force, and eventually making a move against the state. This was a long-term plan, and there was nothing imminent as far as we know, but it was clearly something the government couldn't countenance, and that's why we've had all of these arrests. As I say, I don't think this is a regional issue. It's much more an Indonesian issue. But if we did see a militant splinter emerge, who knows what the alliances that could emerge from that. So good to be vigilant in any case. Next. So finally, just a note about what can be done or what to focus on. I think we still have to deal with corruption in the security forces, in immigration, and in prisons, because the production of fake travel documents is something that is one of the best enablers of terrorism in the region. And the more that can be done to halt that kind of production, the better. Secondly, we need to have much more focus on the role of women in extremist networks, which means much more attention to women in police forces and women in intelligence agencies within the region, as well as more effort to understand and gather information on some of the marriage linkages that have taken place abroad. As I mentioned, we need to have more efforts to address this indoctrination of the very young. We've seen a particular phenomenon in Eastern Indonesia of Quran memorization schools for very young children. And this offers some possibilities of thinking through how you could attract young children with new technologies, perhaps, but focusing on the very young is critical. We need to improve counterterrorism awareness training for migrant workers going overseas, and that's particularly for women who are often seen as cash cows by jihadists, male jihadists in their home countries. And then the male jihadis try to establish online dating relationships with women domestic workers abroad. So I think training is necessary both in the sending and in the host countries. The fifth recommendation is really don't abandon the men and women and children who are stranded in those Syrian camps. I think whatever the risks, it's more important to get these people back and out of the terrible situation that they're in than to leave them there. And finally, we need to do more with regional information sharing, although there has been a huge amount of progress made over the last 3 or 4 years. There's still a long way to go. And the biggest problem is not between countries, it's the internal bureaucracies within countries. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Sidney. As usual, it's a master class which we have gotten used to hear from you. We have begun having some very interesting questions. As I invite my colleagues from the audience to continue to send in the questions, perhaps I can start off by asking you to perhaps give your assessment of what has been called the trend of family terrorism. I mean, there have been recent articles commenting on the fact that it seems that increasingly families, entire families, are involved in terrorist attacks. So, is this enough? Has this happened enough times for you to think that this actually represents a significant trend which governments and civil society need to address?
I think we do have to address that, although it's important to recognize that when families have been involved, it hasn't been for the same reason. So if we look at the Surabaya bombers, one motivation of the lead family was that they believed the world was coming to an end and wanted to ensure that their children had guaranteed access to heaven when the adults detonated the bombs and therefore were guaranteed access to heaven. So they can their understanding of the rewards from the suicide bombing were that they could bring their family with them to heaven at a time when the world was coming to an end. But that's very different than the woman and child who killed themselves in Sibolga in North Sumatra, where there had been a pact between the husband and wife that if the husband got arrested, then there would be the woman would go and attack the police in retaliation. But it's also not something that's particular to Indonesia. As noted, we saw this recent Tunisian case, and Sri Lanka, of course, was also an attack involving a family. So I do think we need to be aware of it. We need to understand that when there are religious discussion groups in extremist circles, we need to focus not just on the discussion circles for the men, but also for the women and what provisions are made for educating the children.
Thank you very much, Sidney. There's a very interesting question here. Do you think that the ISIS-influenced suicide bombings in Indonesia and the Philippines are part of larger coordinated campaigns or semi-isolated individual events? If they are indeed suicide bombing campaigns, what is the ultimate objective? What is ISIS' long-term strategic plan for the region, in your view?
I don't think these are coordinated. I don't think they're directed. They're ISIS inspired, but there isn't coordination as far as we know. There isn't even coordination within Indonesia. There's no connection between the attack on police headquarters and the attack in Makassar, and no communication. So I think that one of the consequences of the disintegration of pro-ISIS structures is that we're seeing autonomous cells and individual lone wolves appear more than in the past, and those are by definition harder to detect.
Thanks, I agree with you, Sidney. A question here. What is your current take on the linkage or command and control influence of ISIS Central on Indonesian militant groups?
Basically, none. We don't know of any direct communication from ISIS Central to various groups. There's communication from Syria of people with their families, and there's also efforts to get announcements of Indonesian attacks into ISIS publications, online publications. But in terms of direction, no, I don't think, I haven't seen a single example of such communication.
Thank you. Question here on the impact of COVID-19 actually. What do you think might be the medium-term impact of COVID-19 on regional terrorism trends? Have militants been coordinating plans with reference to COVID, for example, taking advantage of COVID to cripple governments or wait until life is normalized before conducting attacks, etc.? How is COVID impacted the threat picture in your view?
I think it's actually quite limited on the from the perspective of the extremists. We did see the small group in Poso that is pro ISIS and continuing to wage war on the police and military, although they're down to 9 people or 7 people at the moment. But they very much saw COVID as an ally in fighting Islam's enemies and saw COVID as a force that was weakening the West and was weakening opposition, weakening its enemies inside Indonesia. So now was the time to strike. But we haven't really seen other groups make that particular argument. The biggest consequence of COVID has been the difficulties it has imposed on security forces in their own effort to undertake operations, because it's difficult to move around. This is particularly the case in the Philippines. And after Chichi, for example, this Indonesian woman was arrested in October. It took until January for anybody from the Indonesian consulate in Manila to have contact with her because of travel restrictions imposed by COVID. So I think it's COVID has had a big impact, but perhaps not in the way we thought.
Thanks. Related to the COVID point, question here is, could you comment a bit about the increasing chatter about targeting ethnic Chinese I believe, related to the COVID situation? And second, the comment is about okay, I'll read the question. Your point about GI is interesting, but this person is struck by how much concern there is about a group which has not launched attacks in a long time. I mean, it's true, GI hasn't really done anything. So how credible is the GI threat to the state from your perspective?
Okay, on the ethnic Chinese, no question that the combination of COVID and the importation of Chinese workers for infrastructure projects in Indonesia has raised anti-Chinese sentiment. But there's chatter. There hasn't been any serious plan for attack. One of the people recently arrested and labeled as an FPI member, a member of the Islamic Defenders Front, said that one of the plans that he had was to attack Chinese industries and so on. But there hasn't been any systematic operation against the ethnic Chinese, and the government's very aware of the dangers of any violence against Chinese. So while anti-Chinese sentiment is increasing, and I think the government should be more wary of the impact of bringing these workers in, but we haven't seen violence, and I think it's a problem that's under control. Touch wood.
Yep.
Okay, on JI, um, uh, I don't know, to tell you the truth, how much of a threat they constituted. I think any government that saw an organization with an extremist ideology putting together a military force would get anxious and arrest those people. There's not a government in this region that would countenance that kind of activity. But it doesn't seem at the moment that any of the senior JI leadership uh, was planning an attack or planning to use that force in any immediate setting. There was this one splinter, and the possibility that there could be other splinters is real. But it's a very different kind of organization, JI is, than the pro-ISIS groups. It had a structure, it had lengthy indoctrination. It actually, one of its intellectuals actually wrote this piece back in 2010, which is still something that's worth circulating, about how suicide bombing was narcissistic. Why do you think you're glorifying yourself? What good are you doing to the ummat, to the Muslim faithful? And at the time, they argued, if you really want to strengthen the Muslim faithful, send more people into engineering and professional sciences and get them highly educated.
Right. Still on JI. So, what is your assessment now that of JI's threat levels? Now that Para Vijayanto has been arrested, who is leading JI or who's the caretaker now? And you,
I don't think JI has a caretaker right now. I think the most important influence is probably still Abu Rustan, who is free and a public figure. But I think JI has a history of being able to weather devastating waves of arrest, lie low, rebuild, regenerate, and in maybe 6 or 7 years, we'll begin to see more activity on the part of JI, and maybe we'll see the name of a caretaker, Amir. But for the moment, I think JI has just frozen its activities.
right. Thanks. Related to that as well, we all know that Abu Bakr Bashir is now out of prison. So this is actually a question I wanted to ask as well. Not just the questioner here is asking about Abu Bakr Bashir's impact, but I was also going to ask you about your assessment of the influence of Aman Abdurrahman as well. So these two individuals, what do you think is their influence now?
So Aman Abdurrahman uh, is in effective solitary confinement, but his writings continue to be used as teaching materials in virtually every pro-ISIS discussion group. So in that sense, he remains a very influential cleric. Uh, through both his own writings and his translation of other people's writings. Abu Bakr Bashir never wrote anything. There are a couple of collections of his speeches floating around, but he wasn't an intellectual in the same sense, and his religious knowledge wasn't anywhere as deep as Aman Abdurrahman's. Now that he's out of prison, he's an elder statesman. He'll be receiving visitors up the wazoo. But is he going to increase the threat of violence now that he's released? I don't think so. I think he will have an impact perhaps in Solo and in the central Java region in bridging some of the fractiousness among some of the extremist groups, but I don't think he's going to significantly increase the risk.
Thank you. Moving still in Indonesia, moving to the interesting question, what is your opinion about the linkages between FPI and JAD, given that recent terrorist attacks, arrests in Indonesia were affiliated with them? And also, do you think that Indonesia's National Action Plan on PCVE would be significant in having an impact on the counterterrorism policy?
In terms of FPI, I think it's important to note that from August 1998, when FPI was created jointly by the police and military, uh, as almost as a civilian auxiliary, until the return of Habib Rizik Shihab, the leader from Saudi Arabia, in November last year. There wasn't a single instance of FPI bombing or use of guns. They used, it's not a nice organization, it's an intolerant group of thugs that had very majoritarian views and helped bring down Ahok, the governor of Jakarta at the time. But they used sticks and stones and pipes in vandalism and in occasional attacks on people, beating mostly. But they weren't terrorists. The fact that a couple of the people arrested were amassing, or police say they were amassing explosives, I think may almost be a self-fulfilling prophecy that some of these people arrested after the banning of FPI may have been seeking retaliation. So it's possible that the allegations against this last group of people are true, but in general, FPI is not a terrorist organization. That said, in January 2015, there was a ceremony at FPI headquarters where the leader of JAD Makassar, a man named Ustad Basri, now dead, uh, partnered to hold a mass oath-taking pledge of loyalty to ISIS. It wasn't individual oaths. It was basically Ustad Basri asking everybody who supported ISIS to raise their hand, and everybody nearly in the audience did. And it was hundreds of FPI members involved. 3 months later, however, FPI in Makassar basically ordered its people to choose. You either choose to go with Ustad Basri or you choose FPI. But FPI pulled away from the more militant groups in Makassar. So the family that I talked about, the family that was involved in the Holo bombings and the extended group that was arrested in January, almost all of the men had been at that ceremony in January 2015, and some of them were active members of FPI for more than just a few months. But by and large, FPI distanced itself from terrorism in April 2015.
Right, thank you. This is a rather thoughtful question, actually. This relates to your earlier comment about the increasing trend of international marriages between widows, Southeast Asian widows and foreign fighters. So the question here is on the international or internation racial marriage practiced by ISIS members. So the question is, how can the authority actually deal with this? You know, when religion's mandates actually encourages such marriages, I mean, between Muslim and Muslim, right? And if there are initiatives on this, will it not be seen as overstepping on the part of the relevant authorities from the perspective of the Muslim community?
I think it's just a question of making sure the states in the region gather as much information as possible about the second marriages of their own nationals, and that they keep track where possible of who some of the women who joined ISIS married, so that if there's another case, for example, of an Indonesian woman who married a Tunisian, that somehow Detachment 88 can have that information and check with Tunisian authorities about the background of the husband. Because the last thing you want is to have an open door to extremists from North Africa or West Africa or wherever come into this region because of marriages that they made in Syria. So I agree that you don't want to overdo it, and you don't want to turn all the women in Syrian camps into a vast spying effort or whatever. But I just think it's part of vigilance to try and gather as much information as possible about these marriages.
Thank you. There's a question here about relating to your earlier comment about the Tafiz schools in Indonesia. Basically, the questioner is asking, are you implying that every Tafiz school in Indonesia could be the source of indoctrination? I think just asking for clarification.
Yeah, no, not at all. Obviously, every Islamic group in Indonesia has Quran memorization schools, and some of them are wonderful. It just is striking as a trend that some of the JAD linked groups, particularly in West Nusa Tenggara, that was one area where we've documented this, have focused on setting up Quran memorization schools for the children of their members. And I think it opens up an opportunity for the other organizations, the mainstream organizations that have Quranic memorization schools, to actually offer their model and set up schools in the same neighborhood so they can attract these children or attract the parents of these children to enroll in non-extremist schools. So I think Quranic memorization schools are generally a good thing. I just think that we need to be aware of the fact that extremists are using them.
Thanks. A couple of questions relating to the modalities of terrorist attacks. So a question here is about, we have come across in the region terrorist attacks involving, IEDs, also parangs, no vehicle ramming attacks, no chem bio attacks. So do you see that, this trend of, this sort of trend will continue?
Well, let's hope we won't see any truck ramming incidents. We understand that one of the reasons we haven't seen that in Indonesia is because there's a concern about Muslim deaths or collateral damage that might emerge from one of these ramming into a group of pedestrians. But we've had a couple of incidents of motorcycle ramming. They just haven't been very successful. So I think in general, we should be grateful for the fact that Indonesia is so low tech when it comes to its terrorists, and the fact that many of them are using a sword or a BB gun in this case, or a very crude kind of bomb, is something that means that the casualties are kept low. I think there could be a real sea change if the level of weaponry were to increase. I'll just tell you one thing. After the Indonesians from JAD succeeded in buying 30 guns from the Philippines in late 2015, and they were trying to get them back to Indonesia, the guy who bought the guns suddenly realized, who's going to use these? We don't have anybody who's trained in sniper shooting. That none of our members now have had international training. We're beyond the Afghan generation. We're beyond the Mindanao generation. And we're even beyond the people with combat experience in Ambon and Poso. So who knows how to use a gun?
Right. Perhaps moving to the Philippines now. Question here. You discussed the breakdown of the IS East Asia Velaya coalition. So could you please discuss the dynamics between various Islamist extremist groups in Mindanao and Sulu, for example, BIFF, ASG, Sahiran's faction, the Maute remnants, the relevance of Mundi Sawatjan in IS Sulu as a potential leader and his preference for planning suicide bombings, Do these groups compete for recruits and resources?
It's so complicated. That's why the Philippines is the miasma of countries with a terrorist problem. So we still see isolated cases of pro-ISIS fighters in Lanao, where Marawi was, but there isn't anyone who's emerged as the leader, as far as we know. In the central part of Mindanao, in the area around Maguindanao and Sultan Kudarat and north and south Cotabato, we've seen a change, because it used to be of the three factions of BIFF, of BIF, the Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Fighters, that the faction led by Abu Taraifi was the most active. The most recent incidents, however, have all been led by Karyalan, that we thought was the more moderate of the three factions. So it's not clear what's happening there, except that Toraifi, Abu Toraifi, who was the individual who had the best connections with the Sawajaans and some of the factions in Holo, is now quite ill and not as active as he was before. In terms of the Sawajaan clan itself, after Hajan Sawajaan was killed in July last year, his nephew Mundi took over the Sulu operations as much as anyone can, because no one's the dominant commander there. But there's no suggestion that he took over as Amir of the broader coalition, or indeed that there is an Amir of the broader coalition. The one person whose name has been mentioned as a potential commander and who has the seniority to play that role is Salahuddin Hassan, who operates in the central Mindanao area, not in Holo. But what we've seen is the gradual division or return to division between the ethnic Maguindanons of central Mindanao and the ethnic Yakan and Tausug of the Sulu archipelago. And it doesn't seem like there's a lot of collaboration going on between them.
Thank you. Another question on the Philippines. Recently, the Jikiri and Mushwari factions of MNLF have basically united to form one MNLF. Will this pose as a threat, knowing that both groups are disgruntled due to the MILF leadership leading the autonomous region in Muslim Mindanao?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest dangers now in the Philippines results from the untimely death of Yusuf Jakiri. He was the chairman of the MNLF. He was working with the Philippine military to use MNLF forces against Abu Sayyaf, and he was also going after and actually had several armed clashes with Nur Miswari's forces, who were protecting kidnappers from the Abu Sayyaf. His death from cancer last October has left a huge vacuum. So when the questioner talks about the alliance between Miswari and Jakiri factions, it's actually an alliance between Miswari and Jakiri's not very impressive son named Tong, who would like very much to be governor at some stage of Sulu, and is making various arrangements to partner with people that can assist his political ambitions. I don't believe any of these alliances in Sulu are going to be lasting, because it's not just Miswari and the Jakiri son, it's also the governor of Sulu, Sakur Tan, with his longtime political rivals, and with Tong Jakiri, even after his father was one of the Sulu governor's worst enemies. So it's as though suddenly all Sulu now is happiness, peace, and light, because, as the questioner mentioned, they are angry with mainland Mindanao's control of the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao of BARM. And they believe that people from Sulu have been systematically excluded and Sulu interest abandoned as a result of MILF control of BARM. And they believe that the Sulu people are not getting the appropriate representation on the BARM in the BARM management structure. And yes, I do think that this could lead to problems with splinter groups emerging. And when we talk about splinter groups in the Philippines, we're always talking about armed groups.
Right. In this connection, perhaps I can come in here. There was a really very interesting IPAC report on Salafism in Mindanao not too long ago. So I was going to ask you, what prompted IPAC to write this assessment? What is the concern about the Salafist situation in Mindanao?
I thought it was interesting. First of all, that paper was written by my former colleague, Nava Noorania, who's now doing her PhD at ANU, and a former colleague of yours. But it was a terrific paper, but we decided to do that research because nobody was asking questions about what kind of Islam the MILF involved in the establishment of BARM was interested in applying. There was lots of talk about applying Sharia. There was lots of talk about Islamic courts being established, but nobody was looking at what kind of Islam are people talking about. And we had enough information about the Saudi trained ulama in Muslim Mindanao that we were we wanted to get a sense of what the social environment would be in this new autonomous region. And that's why we looked at the increased support for Salafism, particularly among the younger generation. It was the university educated, the people as young professionals who saw piety and stricter observance as being an important part of their own identity.
Right. Thank you. So question here about the influence of international developments on the extremism landscape. For example, the situation of the Rohingyas, is that having an impact on the developing extremism landscape, and also the Chinese actions in Xinjiang? So have you seen anything of note?
So in, I think, October or November, there emerged what appeared to be a booklet published by a pro-ISIS splinter of ARSA, of the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, whose members mostly are operating now out of the Bangladeshi refugee camps. This booklet appeared to be an indication that there had been a splinter of ARSA into a more militant group that was based among the Rohingya diaspora in Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. But nobody's delved into this enough to find out much. What we can say with some certainty is that there's no evidence that this is picking up traction in the Bangladeshi camps or among Rohingya more generally. So it's worrisome. It's an indication of a possible scenario that we hope doesn't materialize, but it's not something that seems to be catching on among the other Rohingya, who remain committed to using their struggle to attain full citizenship rights in Myanmar. In terms of Xinjiang, uh, uh, as you know, the Chinese pressure to deport the Uyghurs who had been released from prison after fighting in Poso was just enormous. So in October, we had 3 Uyghurs deported back to China. We don't know what happened to them. There's one Uyghur who is still in detention and will be released in December. And then there's one other who got a longer sentence, and he has, I think, 2 years to go. So the one who will be released in December is actually got a full Turkish passport, a genuine Turkish passport. So he's a Uyghur, but a Turkish national, so he won't get deported back to China. The other guy is more of a concern. What we haven't seen is any further evidence of a Uyghur presence in Indonesia, or indeed of Uyghurs coming out of Xinjiang into Southeast Asia, the way we saw them flooding into Southeast Asia in 2015. There's still a lot of people who are of concern to UNHCR, but the exodus because of Chinese policies has effectively stopped.
Thank you. Could I ask you a question? There have been a few questions about Malaysia. So essentially, the questions relate to what is your assessment of the signature and profile of ISIS and JI in Malaysia?
I think there's certainly a presence of ISIS supporters, mostly online, in the people who formed online groups. It doesn't constitute a major threat to Malaysia in any way, and the Malaysian authorities have been very quick to pick up on some of these groups and arrest them. In several cases, they've involved Indonesians as well, both in peninsular Malaysia and in Sabah. And as I say, I think we have to be aware of the fact that radical cells can emerge among these migrant workers. And it's a tiny, tiny, tiny proportion of radicalized migrant workers among the total. But it's nevertheless something that we need to be aware of. We even had one case of a guy, an Indonesian guy, who was in Syria as a fighter, got disillusioned, paid his way out to Turkey, got himself deported to Malaysia in the hopes that he could join the throngs of illegal workers getting deported from Malaysia and come back into Indonesia undetected. Unfortunately, the immigration authorities at the airport were too smart for him, and he was arrested by the Malaysian authorities and deported anyway.
Right. A quick question here about relating to Malaysia. Is there more information on the Malaysian couple that traveled to Zamboanga with Ruli's family in January 2019? Just a specific question.
There isn't. We have their names, or at least the names that Chichi gave the police, but who knows whether they bear any resemblance to the real names. And the Malaysian police are still waiting for assistance from their Philippine colleagues to turn over numbers or contacts that may have been on Chichi's phone. But as far as I know, that hasn't happened yet.
Thanks. I have a question here which I've been burning to ask for a while. This relates to your earlier comment about Sabah as a potential safe haven. But actually, going back to some of the work IPAC has done about how there seems to be ideological toggling between individual jihad and organized jihad, right? And how in the past, apart from Muslim Mindanao, Poso has also been seen as a potential base. And of course, a decade ago, we had the Aceh group, right, which you wrote about as well. So what is the status of this debate within the extremist community in the region, particularly, I suppose, in Indonesia?
Well, I think for the most part, it's not so much a debate, it's a conclusion now that individual jihad is justified because organized jihad is not possible. I think there are very few of the people arrested who would be able to phrase it in those terms. But I think that it underscores one of the major differences between JI and the people who were supporters of ISIS, that uh, this idea that you could go off on your own and individual and wage individual jihad was very much part of the standard teaching from ISIS in a way that it wasn't from JI.
Right. Thank you. I have a question about the influence of Hizb ut-Tahrir uh, in the region. How do you see them in terms of their impact on the extremism landscape?
Well, Hizb ut-Tahrir was formally banned last year as part of this effort by the Jokowi government to systematically weaken every one of the organizations that was involved in the campaign to bring down Ahok in December 2016. And Hizb ut-Tahrir was an organization which was seen as undermining Pancasila, the Indonesian state ideology. And indeed, it did have a plan to infiltrate the armed forces and the Indonesian government. And its strategy, also long term, was to create a critical mass of supporters who could then undertake a so-called bloodless coup. But uh, it was far from reaching its critical mass, and the ban has had no effect. Hizb ut-Tahrir continues to be as active as ever, except it doesn't use its flag and it doesn't use its attributes with its name and so on. But the Hizb ut-Tahrir agenda is visible, its websites are active, its leaders are still public figures. So difficult to know what the impact of the ban has been.
Do you think that the Hizb ut-Tahrir message, does act as as some people have talked about, conveyor belt to more violent extremist acts?
Not very much. Hizb ut-Tahrir is a non-violent organization itself that supports violence by others. And there have been about a dozen Hizb ut-Tahrir members who have crossed over into pro-ISIS activities. All of those crossovers through personal linkages, many of them to Bahrum Naim. But I wouldn't say Hizb ut-Tahrir was a gateway to terrorism any more than I would say FBI was a gateway to terrorism.
That's fair enough. A couple of questions on de-radicalization programs in Southeast Asia. If you look at the efforts of de-radicalization in the region, what would be your assessment?
It's I don't know how you effectively assess de-radicalization because it's not enough to just look at, for example, prisoners who are released who don't return to violence, because most of those people who don't return to violence make the decision on their own not to do so, not because of any kind of government intervention. So how you assess the quality or the impact of government programs is not clear. And in general, generic programs like large lectures in hotel rooms for journalists or teachers or mothers or what, they don't have very much impact. And the best programs are ones that involve long-term mentoring, but that's first of all not cheap. It's something that you have to make a real commitment to, and you have to find the right people who can become mentors. That said, in the last 18 months or so in Indonesia, we've seen 4 or 5 of the top hardcore ideologues recant their commitment to ISIS in a way I never would have believed possible. And that includes Royce, who is the man on death row and the field coordinator for the 2004 Australian embassy bombings. It includes Zainal Anshori, one of the first amirs of JAD in 2015. It includes Willem Maksum, who was one of the Bandung-based people who helped set up the Mujahideen of Western Indonesia. And it includes the founder of JAD in Eastern Indonesia, in Ambon and North Maluku, a man named Iskandar. All of these people have gone over to the government side because of very careful mentoring by some very carefully chosen individuals.
So, Sidney, in the case of these guys you mentioned, are they merely disengaged from violence, or have they, like, been de-radicalized ideologically in your assessment?
Well, how do you know? I mean, but it isn't just pulling away from violence. It's a change in views that some of the teachings of ISIS were wrong. So de-radicalization, I mean, it's not a particularly helpful term, but in this case, I think it's more than just a change in behavior.
Right. Well, that's interesting. Thanks. Okay, we have an interesting question here. Looking at potential terrorist hotspots around the globe that might draw fighters, do you see interest by terrorists in this region to join the fight in places such as Africa, which has been quite active over the past year? So once travel restrictions ease, should we be worried about what is happening over there and the potential impact on Southeast Asia?
We've never seen Indonesians show any interest in traveling to Africa, although there is this one case that we know of a Hong Kong domestic worker who married a Senegalese fighter in Syria. And I don't know what's happened to her. But it's Afghanistan, it's Khorasan that attracted Indonesians, in part for the same reasons that Syria or Sham attracted Indonesian fighters. This was one of the places where the black banners of Khorasan were going to emerge and the forces of the Imam Mahdi would appear. And there are now 11 Indonesians, if I'm not wrong, detained in a Kabul prison for having tried to join IS Khorasan, and there are about another 10 outside somewhere in Afghanistan who tried to join. They tried to join as families as well. So it was the phenomenon of people who realized they couldn't get to ISIS, but believed that IS Khorasan was a functioning Islamic state the way ISIS had been at the beginning. So there's a husband, wife, and 2 kids among the people in prison.
Thanks. A related question here. Marawi really attracted foreign fighters, including Indonesians, as a jihad battlefield. But we haven't seen this in the Rohingya case. So is this really the case? And why do you think there's no movement in that direction?
Well, Marawi was actively seeking fighters, and it was a very easy transportation situation to get from anywhere in Indonesia or Malaysia to the Philippines. In fact, while there was a lot of stepped up marine patrols at the time of Marawi, most of the Indonesians who tried to join took Cebu Air and Air Asia into Manila Airport, and then tried to get domestic flights into Cagayan de Oro or into Zamboanga and move up. So it wasn't a case of trying to enter illegally for most of the people who tried to join. It's a very different situation in Rakhine State. Or in Bangladesh for that matter. It's not easy to suddenly join the Rohingyas, even though there would be no shortage of volunteers if channels opened up to do so. But first of all, there wasn't the same kind of organized structure that there was in the Philippines. So if you wanted to join the Rohingya, how do you do it? There isn't the same language or cultural connections that there were before. The Myanmar Tatmadaw is a much more uh, uh, a much stronger enemy in some ways of any kind of Islamic forces than you would find in the southern Philippines. Although the army is doing an extremely good job moving against the Abu Sayyaf in that area. But in general, it was just a much harder operation, and it wasn't possible for people to join.
Thanks, Sidney. An interesting question here about Xinjiang. I'll read it. Do you think the Xinjiang model is successful in stemming terrorism, and should it be adopted in the region?
Well, anybody who thinks I would answer yes to that needs to have their head examined. I don't think it's a good model. I think it's creating and a whole ethnic group that's going to want revenge and retaliation in future years. And I think it's an appalling use of state technology and state tactics against a minority group that has seen their own culture and way of life be destroyed.
Yeah, I agree with you, Sidney. Uh, we'll be coming to the end pretty soon. As you can see, Sidney, there have been tons and tons of questions for you, which just tends to happen whenever you speak, right? But before you go, maybe I'm going to ask you for your assessment of non-Islamist extremist threats which the region should be aware of this coming year. I mean, so I was just wondering whether you have any thoughts about that.
Well, I think we always have to be alert in Myanmar to radical Buddhism and the anti-Islamic efforts of radicalized Buddhist monks. Although with the coup in Myanmar, I don't think that's going to be the top issue that people are addressing. I think we haven't seen any white power extremism in the maritime Southeast Asia. Uh, the question is whether there's any possibility it could emerge in places with large numbers of expatriates and expatriate white men. But I think the likelihood is quite low. In terms of uh, any other kind of movement, I suppose I don't think this is likely. I don't think this is likely in the slightest. But there was this tiny little group in Bali that was trying to establish links with the BJP at one stage, but it wasn't terrorist in nature.
Right. Well, we had in Singapore a far right, a young guy who was influenced by Brenton Tarrant's ideology, arrested in January, but so far it's been the only one. Uh, it's been great as usual, Sidney, just sitting here and listening to you answering all these flood of questions as usual. It's my role nowadays. but I've learned a lot as usual, and I was always glad to see you and to hear from you. So I'm sure my colleagues here would like to express their collective thanks to you for taking time off from your busy schedule to share your ideas and insights with us. And it was a great presentation. So I hope that you will still remain engaged with us. And once all the COVID restrictions go away, we certainly would like to have you down here as well, so you can
Great.
give us face.
Great.
So thanks very much, Sidney, and all the best. Have a good day.
Okay, you too. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.